only in the context of the violence that occurred to men, women, and children at the hands of Missouri mobbers, and worse than mobbers, at the hands of Missouri militiamen in places like Far West and Hans Mill and DeWitt. Only understanding that context can one fully understand the letters that Joseph Smith will write to the church that will later become Doctrine and Covenants section 121, 122, and 123. These letters are most often viewed by people in terms of Joseph's great personal suffering. And in fact, if you had to pick a low point in Joseph's life, this was certainly the new low point. Joseph suffers a lot, so there's actually a lot of low points. But this is perhaps the lowest. I mean, he's been at least ordered to be shot, although that order was belayed. But he knows that many of the authorities in Missouri want him to be executed. Separated from his family, obviously physically and verbally abused by his guards, and you know, in filthy, horrible conditions, fed rotting food, just not even given blankets for the winter. I mean, it is unjust treatment for sure. And so we generally take D&C 121, 22, and 23, and we go to them because of the comforting words that the Lord speaks to Joseph Smith, because we want to be able to internalize that for ourselves. We want to be able to say, you know, when I'm suffering, the Lord still loves me, right, and still wants to speak peace to my soul. And that's a fine reason to go to D&C 121 and 22. I'm not saying they're not. But it is important to realize that these are, those sections are letters that are much longer. They are letters that you have in your reading. So if you haven't read this yet, you need to go do it. They're much longer, and they include many more aspects and details. And of course, they're incredibly beautiful teachings. And so when they reformat and put out a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876, one of the things that Orson Pratt's committee does is they excerpt several portions of these letters, and they print them, they're canonized and printed as sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Pratt, you know, I guess he could have published all the letters, but the letters they're very, very long. And so like he did with Joseph Smith history when he excerpted it, he simply grabbed what he thought was most important for people to learn from that teaching, and then it canonized that. But for our purposes, when we want to more fully understand the revelation, it's very helpful to understand and to read and to understand that Joseph's anger, Joseph's despondency, Joseph's the reason why he's crying out, God, where art thou, is not because of the suffering he's enduring. Yes, he is suffering, and that is part of it. But it's after he lists off all the calamities that have befallen members of the church, how vile the Missourians have been, the horrible things that they've done, some of which, again, you've read about. But it's only after listing off all of those things that then Joseph says, God, where are you? And Joseph asks the same question that every suffering saint then, now, and until the end of time will ask, and that is, how could this horrible, horrible thing be happening to me if God is a God of love and if God is all-powerful? How is it that I have done everything that has been asked of me, and yet I suffer so poignantly? Every human, every person, every man or woman who has endured horrible loss asks this universal question. There are questions that bind the human family together, and one of those is, why did this horrible, horrible thing happen to me? or to my loved one or to my friends? And that's the question that Joseph's asking. The pavilion that covereth the hiding place, that question he's asking is, why is it that you've allowed these things to happen to righteous and good people? And that is certainly something that Joseph Smith is going to have to deal with. The portion where he asks this question, right? It starts our D&C 121. O God, where art thou, and where's the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place? How long shall thy hand be stayed? But in reality, this is midway through a letter in which Joseph has listed off the murders, the assaults, the desecration of bodies, the utter inhumanity displayed by the Missourians. That's why that question is so much more poignant. How long shall they suffer these wrongs and unlawful oppressions before thine heart shall be softened towards them and thy bowels be moved with compassion towards them? It's much later in the letter that Joseph says that as he's contemplating these things, the Spirit whispers to his mind, my son, peace be to thy soul, thine adversity and thine affliction shall be but a small moment. And then if thou endure it well, God shall exalt thee on high. Thou shalt triumph over all thy foes. Thy friends do stand by thee, and they shall hail thee again with warm hearts and friendly hands. Thou art not yet as Job. Thy friends do not contend against thee. Of course, several of Joseph's friends had betrayed him, but he did still have some friends who were on his side. Neither charge thee with transgression as they did Job. Of course, some of Joseph's friends did charge him with transgression, but some did not. Joseph was not totally alone. It's later that this question is going to focus more solely on Joseph, right? The ends of the earth shall inquire after thy name, and fools shall hold thee in derision, and hell shall rage against thee. Verses 5, 6, and 7 aren't hypotheticals of what is going to happen. As you can see, if thine elder son, although but 6 years of age, shall cling to thy garments and say, my father, why can't you stay with us, O my father? What are the men going to do with you? And if then he shall be thrust from thee by the sword, and thou shalt be dragged to prison, and thine enemies prowl around thee like wolves for the blood of the Lamb, if thou shouldst be cast into the pit or be surrounded by murderers, the sentence of death passed upon thee, and if thou be cast into the deep, if the billowing surge conspire against thee, fierce winds become thine enemy. If the heavens gather blackness and all the elements combine to hedge up the way, and above all, if the very jaws of hell shall gape open the mouth wide after thee, know thou, my son, that all these things shall give thee experience and be for thy good. This idea that even incredibly righteous people will suffer horribly. They will suffer the consequences of others' actions. They will suffer the consequences of no one's actions. They will suffer simply as a result of being in mortality, disease and sickness, going through natural disasters like earthquakes and tornadoes. There is great suffering that takes place even when it's not based upon someone's agency. All of it innocent suffering. No one did anything to cause much of that suffering. But here we learn that at least somehow our mortality and our suffering is designed to make us more like God, to teach us and to give us experience. Though great lines from D&C 122 remind us that however horrifically we've suffered, we literally can't have suffered as much as Jesus did. The reality is, when terrible things happen to us, sometimes people will say to us, oh, I know how you feel when I I have a good friend, actually, who only recently was laid off from his job, his company. He's a vice president of a corporation, and his company was purchased by another company, a sight unseen. They didn't even know the management was selling the company. So the company was bought over the weekend, and they fired everybody in the management that Monday. No warning at all. My friend went to work on Friday, loving his job, thinking he couldn't have been luckier to have the greatest, job that he had, working with great friends, things like that, and showed up on Monday to find out he didn't have a job. He's got a very, large family, 5 kids, and some of them, getting ready to go into high, several in high school, but getting ready to go to college and go on missions, and suddenly their income's just gone. And talking to him, he said, one of the worst parts about this is how many people think that they're helping when they try to compare a completely unrelated situation in their life to this. One in particular, he had a guy come up to him and say, "Wow, yeah, I heard just that immediate layoff. When I was a sophomore in college, I was working a part-time job at the Applebee's, and they reduced my hours in half, and that was really hard." And my friend is a very gracious person, so he thanked them and said, "Oh, that must have been hard." The reality is, if the purpose is to give comfort to someone who's suffering, rarely is saying, "I know what you're going through," a comfort. Because the reality is, we don't ever really know what someone else is going through. Even if it's the exact same event, our situations, our spiritual preparedness, our previous life experiences, all the things that shape us, they cause that event to be felt differently. So it's probably true that no one really understands. When I had a really good friend, he and his wife gave birth to their first baby. There were some complications in her birth. She lived for about a week after she was born, and she died. I went over to their house. I didn't know what to say. Because there's nothing I can say that will bring that baby back. There's nothing I can say that will even temper, even for a second, the pain that they were going through. When my friend opened the door, all I could do was grab a hold of him and hug him and tell him I am so, so, so sorry. To mourn with those that mourn and to comfort those who stand in need of comfort is part of what Jesus expects us to do. Sometimes because we feel awkward when we're trying to comfort people, we try to help them see that their situation is like other people's. And while there might be times that that's effective, I do think that one of the most effective things is simply to just love that person, to offer condolences, and to pray God assuage their anguish somehow. But for all of us who suffer, which is all of us, if you happen to be the one who doesn't, then I guess you can stop listening to this right now. The great, great message of the atonement of Jesus Christ is that there is one person who knows exactly what you are going through. Not kind of sort of does, not as you explain it to them, yeah, that relates to when I got my hours cut as a part-time college employee. Someone who has literally experienced your sufferings and your trials, and that he might know how to succor his people, he suffereth it. Jesus has, through the atonement, borne all of your sufferings and your trials. When he says, I understand the pain you're going through, he means it because he actually felt it. He knows exactly what you're feeling. So the question that Joseph has asked here, the rhetorical question, the Son of Man has descended below them all, or art thou greater than he? The reality is, Joseph already knows the answer. Joseph was never pretending he was greater than the Savior. but it was the reminder that Jesus suffered all of these things. He suffered all of them so that we would not suffer. Not in this life, because we're going to suffer in this life, but so that we wouldn't suffer eternally. And that somehow in a way that we don't understand, all of the horrible things that have happened to us in this life, all of them, they will somehow be made up to us. And that is a glorious promise. And that's one of the things that requires faith. Because when you're suffering and the Lord tells you at some point, I will make this right, your response is usually say, well, I don't want it right in the future. I want it right now. At least that's how I respond when I'm suffering. I want it over now. Not a year from now. I want it over now. And as Joseph struggled those months in Liberty Jail, betrayed by his friends, the abject, senseless, innocent suffering of men, women, and children in Missouri was enough to cause him to say, God, at some point you need to intervene. But the Lord assures them that all flesh is in his hands. In D&C 123, the portion that becomes D&C 123, this is where the Lord tells them that they need to tally up everything that happened to them. All of the assaults, all of the murders, all of the violence, all of the things that were stolen, all of the property damages, all of the slanders, and that they needed to be published to the world. One of the reasons why I share in my classes some of the more horrific scenes of violence from Missouri is that Doctrine and Covenants section 123 specifically says that these things need to be made known to the world. Therefore, it is an imperative duty that we owe not only to our wives and our children, but to the widows and the fatherless, whose husbands and fathers have been murdered under its iron hand, which dark and blackening deeds are enough to make hell itself shudder, or to stand aghast and pale, the very hands of the devil to tremble and to palsy. And also it is imperative duty that we owe to the rising generation, and to all the pure in heart. For there are many yet on the earth among all sects, parties, and denominations who are blinded by the subtle craftiness of men, whereby they lie in wait to deceive, and who are kept from the truth because they know not where to find it. They're only kept from the truth because they know where to find it. Therefore, we should waste and wear out our lives, bringing to light all the hidden things of darkness. It's as a result of this direction that they needed to declare what had actually happened, that many of the affidavits were made. Amanda Barnes Smith affidavit of the murder of her children, her husband and her child, and the wounding of her other child, the attempted murder of her daughters. She makes that affidavit because that's what the prophet tells them to do. That Hiram Smith makes his affidavit of the horrific violence that they heard, that the saints were forced to endure. And so you get those affidavits as a result of what will eventually become D&C 123. And then a little bit of a more hopeful teaching coming in verses 16 and 17. You know, brethren, that a very large ship is benefited very much by a very small helm in the time of the storm, being kept workways with the wind and waves. Therefore, dearly beloved, let us cheerfully do all things that lie in our power, that we may stand still with the utmost assurance to see the salvation of God for his arm to be revealed. Right? Remember, it's by those small and simple things. A ship is gigantic, weighing many tons, and the helm, which is barely any part of it with its small pieces of wood, control and direct that entire ship. And that's an important thing to think about. So as you study these last of the Missouri sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, remember that what's going to happen is they are driven out They're going to settle as refugees in the Quincy area of Illinois. The Quincy residents are going to take them in. There are more Mormons being taken in as refugees than there are people living in Quincy. And yet they still take them in. And after a few months, they're going to move to Commerce. Joseph will eventually be liberated. And after that liberation, will receive other revelations, most notably Doctrine and Covenants, section 124, which will be one of the longest revelations Joseph Smith receives and filled with some of the most powerful doctrines as this first revelation received in Nauvoo.